2nd century BC, a Roman ship laden with amphoras sets sail, its destination unknown, its fate lost to the winds of time.
The ancient Romans had arrived on Brazilian shores over 1,700 years ago.
Part of Brazil's Guanabara Bay, beneath the waves of history, an astonishing discovery in 1982 challenged our understanding of the past.
In an underwater field the size of 3 tennis courts located 15 miles from shore, lay the remains of some 200 Roman ceramic jars, a few fully intact.
There is no doubt at all that it's a Roman wreck. When I went to Brazil in the Bay of Guanabara, I found intact Roman amphoras and lots of broken ones.
These jars spanned an area the size of 3 tennis courts, housing around 200 artifacts.
The jars appeared to be twin-handled amphorae that were used to transport goods such as grains and wine in the 3rd century. But how did they get there? The first Europeans didn't reach Brazil until 1500.
These amphoras, tall and noble, were the quintessential containers of ancient Rome, serving as the vessels for carrying wine, olive oil, and other commodities across the vast expanse of the Roman Empire. They were the unsung heroes of trade, the silent witnesses to countless voyages. Picture this ship, embarking on an extraordinary journey, carrying its cargo of amphoras far beyond the familiar routes of the Mediterranean. A journey so unprecedented, it would challenge our understanding of history itself.
A field of Roman ceramic jars, entombed in the underwater sands, awaited to tell their ancient tales.
These are 2 necks of the Roman amphoras that we found at the Bay of Guanabara. These were called the 5-gallon storage jugs of antiquity.
The work was going forward really well until we had political problems in Brazil, and the project had to stop right there.
Apparently, the site Marx was investigating was so dangerous to the Brazilians, not only was a nationwide ban enacted, but the particular site in question was buried under tons of sand.
Amidst theories of storms and mutinies, the Bay of Jars was closed to further exploration in 1983, ostensibly to prevent looting. Yet, whispers of ulterior motives suggested fears that these discoveries might disrupt the narrative of Brazil's history.
In 1984, the Brazilian government passed a ban on underwater exploration along the entirety of its 4,600-mile coastline. Hundreds of shipwrecks would lie unexplored, and yet the legislation which outlawed these excavations was passed in secrecy.
The drawings I made with the Roman wreck, and right here is the pinnacle that was sticking almost to the surface that the Roman ship hit.
Marx's discovery, located in the Bay of Guanabara, 15 miles from Rio de Janeiro, drew the ire of the Brazilian church, politicians, economic leaders, and indeed, most Brazilians. In 1976, a Brazilian diver was searching for lobsters in the Bay of Guanabara when he stumbled upon 8 unusual-looking jars. Dragging them back to shore, the diver figured he could sell them to tourists as curiosities, which he did, until he was arrested under the suspicion that the ancient-looking jars might be stolen artifacts. 2 of the jars remained in the diver's custody, and the police sent them to experts at the University of Brazil, who quickly recognized the tapered bottoms and distinctive handles typical of amphoras, vessels used for storage in ancient Roman times.
Fast forward to 1982. Enter Robert Marx, an American archaeologist diving into the depths of Guanabara Bay, Brazil. He was on the trail of a mystery that had begun to unravel 6 years prior, when lobster divers reported seeing ancient jars at the bottom of the bay. And as fate would have it, the local divers were right, and he found them. As the waters of Guanabara Bay closed over the ship, the amphoras lay forgotten for centuries, until their discovery stirred up a storm of controversy and mystery. Marx's discovery of these amphoras was met with sighs of disbelief and arched eyebrows of skepticism. How could Roman amphoras, products of the 2nd century BC, find their way to Brazil, a land believed to be discovered by Europeans only in the 15th century AD?
These twin-handled amphorae, symbols of ancient commerce, carried more than goods. They bore the whispers of a history untold. The jar's existence raised questions that beckoned the curious, challenging established histories. How did these artifacts of Roman ingenuity end up in Brazil centuries before European explorers reached its shores?
The story received some attention in the press, and would eventually catch the eye of an energetic marine archaeologist from the United States. Robert Marx began investigating shipwrecks in 1951. Participating in over 5,000 dives over his career, he is widely considered one of the pioneers of underwater archaeology. Marx had a long-standing interest in finding proof of European explorers reaching the Americas before Columbus. So when he heard of the jars, he packed his bags for Brazil, arriving in late 1982 to dive the Bay of Guanabara himself. He would not be disappointed, finding roughly 200 jars in various states of disrepair, including several intact specimens. These were sent to Dr. Elizabeth Will, a classics professor and expert in Roman amphoras at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Quoted by the New York Times in 1984, Professor Will said, "They look to be ancient, and because of the profile, the thin-walled fabric, and the shape of the rims, I suggest they belong to the 3rd century AD. Fragments of the jars later underwent thermoluminescence testing at the University of London, which determined their age could be even older, around 19 BC. Now most likely lost forever, the initial discovery mostly consisted of a number of jars. Diving deeper, Marx would uncover what appeared to be the front of a wrecked ship. But before he could excavate the site, it was covered up in an effort to silence the possible conclusion that could be drawn from the discovery if verified.
Deterred by the skepticism, Marx delved deeper, and after painstaking research, he linked his findings to an ancient shipwreck. The Amphoras he found were not mere anomalies or isolated finds, but remnants of a Roman ship that had somehow found its way to the shores of Brazil, centuries before Christopher Columbus set foot in the Americas.
Marx returned to the site with sonar equipment to further investigate. And beneath the field of shattered pottery, he identified what appeared to be the hull of a ship which had shattered, likely from an impact with a large rock. The rumored discovery of a Roman ship in Brazil became an international news story, and Marx returned home to the States to begin preparations for what would potentially be the greatest discovery of his career. Unfortunately, upon his return to Brazil, Marx found the site covered in tons of sand, in addition to a new government ban on underwater exploration. Virtually every voice of power in Brazil had rallied against Marx and his discovery, launching a media frenzy which turned public opinion fiercely against the American archaeologist. Rewriting a proud nation's history is never easy, but it was especially difficult in the case of 1980s Brazil, which was ruled by an authoritarian military dictatorship at that time. Pedro Álvares Cabral, the Portuguese explorer credited with the discovery of Brazil, was universally beloved by Brazilians, revered as a saint and a national hero. As a predominantly Catholic nation with a tradition of pious faith, the idea that the country was not in fact discovered by Cabral, a Catholic nobleman, brought harsh words from the church. Rio's bishop himself decried Marx's blasphemous assertions, declaring that the mere suggestion of the pagan pre-Christian Romans discovering Brazil heresy. The opposition was not simply religious, and political complications from the discovery quickly came to light. Brazil had a sizable population of Italian immigrants, many of whom wished to become citizens. Rio was an especially attractive destination for expatriates from across the globe due to its natural beauty, temperate climate, and cosmopolitan nature. The Brazilian government enforced an exhausting and expensive citizenship application process, which could only be avoided by Portuguese citizens. Upon news of the Roman shipwreck, the Italian ambassador to Brazil notified officials that all Italian immigrants in the country should be given immediate citizenship, since it was in fact Italy and not Portugal who originally discovered the country. Of course, the Brazilian government had no interest in granting this request. Nonetheless, Italian immigrants staged demonstrations demanding citizenship. Controversy swirling everywhere, the Brazilian government quickly stepped into action, labeling Marx a hoaxer and enacting the underwater ban. Although they have repeatedly denied the claim, it is believed that the Brazilian Navy was responsible for burying the site. Marx had worked with members of the Navy previously, as he said, Ross ship which shattered, likely from an impact with a large rock. The rumored discovery of a Roman ship in Brazil became an international news story, and Marx returned home to the States to begin preparations for what would potentially be the greatest discovery of his career. Unfortunately, upon his return to Brazil, Marx found the site covered in tons of sand, in addition to a new government ban on underwater exploration. Virtually every voice of power in Brazil had rallied against Marx and his discovery, launching a media frenzy which turned public opinion fiercely against the American archaeologist. Rewriting a proud nation's history is never easy, but it was especially difficult in the case of 1980s Brazil, which was ruled by an authoritarian military dictatorship at that time. Pedro Álvares Cabral, the Portuguese explorer credited with the discovery of Brazil, was universally beloved by Brazilians, revered as a saint and a national hero. As a predominantly Catholic nation with a tradition of pious faith, the idea that the country was not in fact discovered by Cabral, a Catholic nobleman, brought harsh words from the church. Rio's bishop himself decried Marx's blasphemous assertions, declaring that the mere suggestion of the pagan pre-Christian Romans discovering Brazil was heresy. The opposition was not simply religious, and political complications from the discovery quickly came to light. Brazil had a sizable population of Italian immigrants, many of whom wished to become citizens. Rio was an especially attractive destination for expatriates from across the globe due to its natural beauty, temperate climate, and cosmopolitan nature. The Brazilian government enforced an exhausting and expensive citizenship application process, which could only be avoided by Portuguese citizens. Upon news of the Roman shipwreck, the Italian ambassador to Brazil notified officials that all Italian immigrants in the country should be given immediate citizenship, since it was in fact Italy, and not Portugal, who originally discovered the country. Of course, the Brazilian government had no interest in granting this request. Nonetheless, Italian immigrants staged demonstrations demanding citizenship. With controversy swirling everywhere, the Brazilian government quickly stepped into action, labeling Marx a hoaxer and enacting the underwater ban. Although they have repeatedly denied the claim, it is believed that the Brazilian Navy was responsible for burying the site. Marx had worked with members of the Navy previously. As he said, "The Navy people I worked with told me the Navy had covered up the site to keep it from being plundered. They also said this thing is causing so much controversy, it's better if you leave." Other government officials told him, Brazilians don't care about the past, and they don't want to replace Cabral as the discoverer. With virtually the entire country against him, Marx left Rio, abandoning his hope of proving ancient Roman contact with Brazil. Of course, these jars alone, even if fully verified, would not make a particularly compelling case for a Roman presence in the Americas. It is very possible that an abandoned or wrecked ship could have floated on its own to the Americas. Yet this cache of jars represents only one out of hundreds of inexplicable ancient Roman artifacts in the New World. An overwhelming consensus of historians insists the Romans did not undertake a transatlantic voyage, yet their ships were certainly sophisticated enough to withstand the journey. While not widely perceived as a seafaring empire, Roman ships possessed many design features hundreds of years ahead of their time. Warships would regularly ferry over 600 passengers across the seas to the Near East and northern points in Europe. Freighting ships could carry up to 1,200 tons of cargo, 10 times the holding capacity of Columbus's Santa Maria. In fact, a ship with the ability to carry this much cargo would not be built again until the 16th century. Up to 120 ships each year would trade goods between Roman ports in northern Africa and India, sailing a distance of approximately 3,500 miles. Rio's Guanabara Bay lies 4,300 miles from the southernmost point of the Roman Empire, suggesting a naval journey to South America was certainly within the technological capabilities of the ancient Romans. In North America, hundreds of Roman coins have been found near the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, with many more being discovered along the eastern seaboard and near the coast of Texas. In most cases, the coins were discovered at a depth that would be consistent with their age. Skeptics declare the coins must have been lost by collectors, but the consistency of their locations, always near major waterways and never west of the Rockies, makes a good case for the coins to have been delivered by some seafaring means. Roman swords, artwork, pins, and more have been found as well, from both coasts of South America and as far north as Nova Scotia. 2 other Roman shipwrecks have been claimed in the Americas, in Galveston Bay, Texas, and in Honduras, although neither are any more verifiable than the Brazilian discovery. While these finds vary widely in their plausibility, the fact remains that the wreck in the Bay of Guanabara is part of a larger, albeit controversial, body of evidence. Additionally, shipwreck sites littered with amphoras found closer to the Romans' home bear a staggering resemblance to the Brazilian find, with remarkable recent discoveries in Spain, Albania, and Cyprus, presenting similar scenarios to the wreck in Rio's Bay. Ultimately, the burden of proving an ancient Roman presence in the Americas lies with those making the extraordinary claim. History cannot be rewritten without an overwhelming consensus among academics and other authorities. A few outlying pieces of archaeological evidence are simply not enough.
This discovery compels us to reconsider the roots of ancient explorers, suggesting that history as we know it might only be the surface of our past's vast and uncharted waters.
As witnessed in Brazil, changing history can create negative reverberations through an entire culture, causing controversy, fear, and outrage. However, when evidence emerges which conflicts with popular religious or national beliefs, history has shown that this evidence can face harsh resistance at best, and even be subject to pure sabotage. Revealing the secrets of our ancient past through tiny fragments our ancestors left behind is challenging enough in any circumstances, let alone when the evidence is literally covered up by powerful institutions, threatened by the answers that may lie in these remnants of our past.
Sealed off and shrouded in controversy, they challenge us to question the boundaries of known history. The closure of the site by Brazilian authorities, aimed at protecting the jars, has inadvertently cast a long shadow over their story, raising debates about the essence of preservation versus the suppression of potentially paradigm-shifting discoveries. With the Bay of Jars sealed, the mysteries of the Roman jars remain submerged and silent.
Part of the wreck is covered over, which is great because that means nobody could have stolen or robbed or plundered the site while we haven't worked on it all these decades.
On June 25, 1985, nearly a year after the law went into effect, the New York Times published a report on the ban. Printed with the mundane headline, "Underwater Exploring is Banned in Brazil," the article tells a fascinating story of controversy, espionage, and historical mystery in a fight between the Brazilian government and an American marine archaeologist named Robert Marx.
New York Times, October 10th, 1982, by Walter Sullivan. Rio artifacts may indicate Roman visit. Artifacts found in a bay near Rio de Janeiro may mark the wreck of a Roman ship that could have reached Brazil 17 centuries before Portuguese adventurers discovered the region, according to a leading underwater archaeologist. A large accumulation of amphoras, or tall jars, of the type carried by Roman ships in the 2nd century BC, has been found in Guanabara Bay, 15 miles from Rio de Janeiro, according to the archaeologist Robert Marx, who is a well-known hunter of sunken treasure. The Portuguese navigator, Pedro Álvares Cabral, is generally credited as having been the first European to reach Brazil in the year 1500. Mr. Marx said yesterday that the Portuguese authorities were trying to block Brazil from issuing him a permit to excavate the wreck he thinks is buried there. Amphoras are tall jars, tapering to the bottom and usually fitted with twin handles. As described by Mr. Marx, they were to the ancient Greeks, Romans, and Phoenicians what the 5-gallon jerry can was to mobile units in World War II. They were used to carry wine, oil, water, or grain on long voyages. Mr. Marx, the author of many books and articles on early exploration and underwater archaeology, believes the amphoras were carried to Brazil on a Roman ship that was blown off course. It may have anchored off Rio, then been driven by a storm onto the reef near where the amphoras now lie. To reach the harbor, he said, it had to be navigated, and therefore could not have been an unmanned derelict. According to Dr. Harold E. Edgerton of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, a pioneer in underwater photography, has worked extensively with Mr. Marx. The amphoras are definitive, both as to the age in which they were used and the identity of the users. Reached by telephone, Dr. Edgerton said of Mr. Marx's qualifications, "For my money, he is as reliable as they come." Mr. Marx, interviewed by telephone at his hotel in Rio, said he suspected a hoax when he first heard of the amphoras, but was convinced a few days ago when he dived at the site and saw an area comparable to 3 tennis courts strewn with jars, most of them broken. He brought some to the surface and plans to have their age and origin authenticated by specialists. The amphoras could not have been planted there, he said. 4 intact amphoras and parts of at least 50 more are on the surface. Digging with his hands into the mud, he encountered some as much as 5 feet down. The jars are barnacle encrusted, and some long ago became enclosed in coral. Mr. Marx believes all coral in that area was killed by pollution 30 or 40 years ago. For years he has sought to prove that Europeans reached the Americas long before Columbus. Because of his well-known interest in this subject, he said yesterday, he was suspicious when informants sought him out to report the Brazilian finds. Fishermen have long reported snagging their nets on sunken jars in that area. They were assumed to be macumba jars, thrown into the sea with native offerings to appease the sea gods, but such jars are usually smaller than amphoras, Mr. Marx said. Divers in search of lobsters in the area, which is on the approach path to the Rio airport, brought up some jars as souvenirs. Last December, Mr. Marx saw one in a Brazilian's living room. 6 years ago, a diver named Jose Roberto Teixeira located the site and recovered 2 complete amphoras. It was he who led Mr. Marx to the site. Mr. Marx has formed a company with Mr. Teixeira to excavate the site, and if granted permission to do so, is offered to donate all finds to the Brazilian government. Mapping the site will be difficult because the water is so polluted that one can see only a few feet, if at all. Mr. Marx hopes with sonar or other devices to probe the mud, in which he believes some of the vessel's wood may be preserved. Recovery of weapons, tools, and other relics of Roman type would leave no doubt about the nature of the ship. If we only find amphoras, Mr. Marx added, then I'm in trouble. June 25th, 1985. Underwater Exploring is Banned in Brazil, by Marlise Simons. A dispute between the Brazilian Navy and an American marine archaeologist has led Brazil to bar the diver from entering the country and to place a ban on all underwater exploration. The dispute involves Robert Marx, a Florida author and treasure hunter, who asserts that the Brazilian Navy dumped a thick layer of silt on the remains of a Roman vessel that he discovered inside Rio de Janeiro's bay. The reason he gave for the Navy's action was that proof proof of a Roman presence would require Brazil to rewrite its recorded history, which has the Portuguese navigator, Pedro Álvares Cabral, discovering the country in 1500. The Brazilian Navy has denied that it covered up the site and has in turn charged Mr. Marx with contraband of objects recovered from other wrecks in this country. Because of this, Navy officials said the dictatorship had issued an order to prohibit him from entering Brazil. To substantiate these charges, the Brazilian officials showed a catalog of an auction held in Amsterdam in 1983, in which they said gold coins, instruments, and artifacts removed from shipwrecks in Brazil were offered for sale on behalf of Mr. Marx and his associates. The officials said many of these objects had not been reported on the diver's inventory, contrary to an agreement with Mr. Marx. Several attempts to give Mr. Marx the opportunity to respond to these charges were unsuccessful. One phone call ended abruptly when Mr. Marx said, "Don't bother me," and then hung up. All other permits for underwater exploration and digging, prolific field in Brazil, have been cancelled as a result of the Marx controversy, and none will be issued until Congress passes new legislation. Although the decision was taken a year ago, it was not publicized and only became known as a result of new inquiries into the Marx case. The ban has affected a number of projects in Brazil's harbors and along its 4,600-mile coastline. Mainly foreign diving teams have discovered a panoply of gold and silver objects, but most of the sites, though known, remain unexplored. In Guanabara Bay of Rio de Janeiro, more than 100 English, French, and Portuguese wrecks lie unexplored, like the pages of an unread underwater history book. But few spots seem to have aroused as much interest and intrigue here as the remains of a ship that struck a reef some 15 miles inside Rio de Janeiro's bay. The story goes back to 1976 when lobster divers found potsherds studded with barnacles just off Governor's Island in the bay. Then a Brazilian diver brought up 2 complete jars with twin handles tapering at the bottom, the kind that ancient Mediterranean peoples widely use for storage and are known as amphoras. Brazilian experts disagree over the age of the jars, which have been turned over to the Navy and stored them in a warehouse. Mr. Marx, who has long sought to prove that other sailors reached the Americas well before Columbus, obtained permission to explore the site in late 1982. Diving at a depth of about 90 feet, he found the parts of perhaps 200 broken amphoras and several complete ones, he said in an earlier telephone interview. According to Elizabeth Will, a professor of classics and specialist in ancient Roman amphoras at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, the jars are very similar to the ones produced at Caus, a Roman Empire colony that was the center for amphora making on the Atlantic coast of Morocco. Reached by telephone, Professor Will said of the fragments she had studied. Adding to the stir, a wealthy businessman, Americo Santarelli, claimed the amphoras as his property. He said he once had taken such a liking to some ancient Sicilian amphoras that he ordered a potter in Portugal to make exact replicas. To age the jars, he said, he dropped 16 of them in the Guanabara Bay in 1961, but collected only 4. In January 1983, when Mr. Marx returned to Brazil to start salvaging the wooden wreck, he said the tides had turned. The Navy people I work with told me the Navy had covered up the site to keep it from being plundered. They also said this thing is causing so much controversy, it's better if you leave. Mr. Marx said he nonetheless went diving and found that the spot where objects had been close to the mud surface were now covered by a large mound. He added that other government officials then told him, Brazilians don't care about the past, and they don't want to replace Cabral as a discoverer. At the captaincy of the port, a division of the Navy, officials said there was no record of the site being covered over. They added, however, that any operation in the bay could only have been carried out with the knowledge and permission of their office. Other Navy officials also said there had been no cover-up. December 2nd, 1984, Shaking History by Richard Hatch. Artifacts found in Guanabara Bay, near Rio de Janeiro, raised the possibility in 1982 that Romans may have discovered Brazil 17 centuries before the Portuguese. Robert Marx, a Florida diver, sought permission from Brazil to excavate an undersea site where amphoras, jars carried by Roman ships in the 2nd century BC, had been found. If he found the remains of a Roman ship, doubt would have been cast on historical accounts that credit Pedro Álvares Cabral, a Portuguese navigator, with first landing in Brazil in 1500. Using special sonar, Mr. Marx reports he and Dr. Harold E. Edgerton, an electrical engineer and professor emeritus at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, search for the Roman wreck, and we definitely found it. In 100 hours of diving at the site, Mr. Marx says, he found at least 200 broken amphoras in the mud and wooden remains underneath where we found all the amphoras, but he has not been able to do any excavating to bring evidence to the surface. In February 1983, 3 months after granting permission to excavate, the Brazilian Navy canceled the permit, Mr. Marx says. He attributes this to political problems. Some Brazilian newspapers, he says, charged we were defaming the name of Mr. Cabral. The Brazilian Navy, he reports, not only said I couldn't poke around, they got a dredge boat and covered the entire site with mud. Last week, Mr. Marx was in Spain, hoping to get in touch with the Navy Museum and the Institute of Culture. I'm trying to get the Spaniards on my side, he said in Cadiz, to convince the Brazilians that it would be in the best interest of everybody to find out the truth.
In 1982, an American treasure hunter named Robert Marx, after receiving a tip from a diver, found several Roman amphorae, jars, in the Guanabara Bay of Brazil. The area is often called the Bay of Jars. If there was no long-distance trade between the Americas and Egypt, how did they get there?
I joined Bob in 1983 when we were diving on this Roman wreck, or what we believe to be a Roman wreck, in Guanabara Bay. Will prove that a Roman vessel entered Guanabara Bay 2,200 years ago and sunk there. We've sat on this for decades now. We have to go back. The evidence is there. We've seen it.
James and I want to go back and continue where I left off all those years ago.
We have to bring all the pieces of this puzzle together in a way that is accepted by archaeologists today.
Theories of their origins range from accidental to deliberate, but the truth remains guarded, 100 feet under the sea.
I want to solve the riddle of the Roman wreck, and I can't go to my grave until that's being taken